Hi and welcome to Eminem Reviews. Just finished watching The Batman. I have a lot of thoughts. This is going to be a spoiler-based review. Let's get started. So I think with any movie, there are kind of like three ways in which you can rate a movie accordingly. So from the first way is the how good was the movie while watching it for the first time. Like just how good was it when I went to the cinema and I watched it. And according to this dimension, I think The Batman is a very good movie actually. I would give it like 7.8 out of 10. I would score it right alongside The Batman Begins, perhaps slightly below Batman The Dark Knight Rises. And the reason The Batman is a very good first time experience, why it is very good the first time you watch it, is I think because it manages to do a lot of things very well. So for example, it's shot excellently. That is to say that the cinematography is really good, it has a really good score. But more than anything, I think it really does manage to create a very, very strong atmosphere. It manages to pull you in to the movie, to kind of like the logic of the world, to the feel of the world, and it manages to hold you there quite steadily for 3 hours, which I think is very impressive, a 3 hour long movie, I mean. Now, the first third is just excellent. Like the first third is just like truly excellent. I was so drawn in. I think anyone in the audience will be drawn in immediately if they have any sense of what a good movie is and if they like Batman to any extent. And there were like parts during the first third of the movie where, you know, I was like kind of like rocking back in the chair of excitement. I almost applauded once I saw the Penguin and how good of an acting job Colin Farrell did. And the interactions between him and Robert Pattinson, I thought they were really, really good. I will say that in terms of pulling you in and gripping you and holding you there, the second third of the movie is a bit weaker. That is the third of the movie that more focuses on the interactions between Batman and Catwoman and the Catwoman storyline and how that intersects with the overall storyline between Batman and the Riddler. I think it wasn't super necessary for it to be there. I think you can question some of the directorial choices there, and the reason that part is a bit weaker is because it feels a bit disjointed with the overarching storyline of Batman trying to figure out the Riddler, what the Riddler is gonna do, of Batman being led down the track of the Riddler, of the Riddler's plan. It wasn't like, it didn't connect super smoothly with that, and also kind of like the vibe of the Batman Catwoman arc wasn't fully the same as the vibe of the rest movie, i.e. the kind of atmosphere in those part of the movie didn't like fully coalesce with the atmosphere of the rest of the movie. So I think to some extent it kind of like lets you go a bit in the second third, but it doesn't let you go super much and it still keeps you there to quite a strong extent. So just if you're interested in going and watching this movie, I truly do think that most people will have a really good experience watching the movie. The problem with the movie, and however, why I ultimately think it doesn't really amount to being a super good movie, or why it actually amounts to being kind of a movie, is because the second dimension according to which you can like enjoy a movie is from the reflective dimension. So that is when you leave the cinema, when you go home and you start thinking about the movie, you start thinking about the experience you just had, and you're like, wow, this was really, really good, or like, I didn't really enjoy that much. And once you start thinking about the movie, it turns out that the movie is actually quite bad. And I mean that like truly it is quite bad. So a big problem with the movie and a big like problem I had going in, or like a big worry I had going into the movie, was that Robert Pattinson from the trailers just didn't look that believable as Batman. And what I mean by that is that Batman, he's supposed to be this super impressive figure, this super impressive character, right? He's supposed to be at the peak of human conditioning, at the peak of human intelligence, at the peak of human dedication, and I think that's like an important part. And the psychology of the Batman is the psychology, and this is why Batman is such a great character, I think, of a person who refuses to acknowledge that there isn't any part of reality that he can't control. He demands control over every part of reality, and this demand for control over reality is a demand that is driven by his fear of what happens if he can't control reality, which stems from the fact that, he lost his parents at a young age and he couldn't control that. Now, not only does one realize upon reflecting upon the movie that the Batman that is portrayed in The Batman, i.e. Robert Pattinson's iteration of the Batman, doesn't have any impressive features to him. It is also true that he doesn't actually align with the fundamental psychological characteristics of the general Batman archetype, and which makes Batman interesting overall. So let me explain. So for example, we've all seen from the trailers that Robert Pattinson just doesn't have a impressive physical stature. He actually said straight out that he didn't do any gymming for the movie, and you can see that, right? He just looks that way when he walks around and when he moves. So now you have reduced one dimension according to which Batman is so supposed to be super impressive. But there are other dimensions. There is this there's the psychological dimension, the impressiveness of being this character, being able to be this person who has this psychological state where they refuse to relinquish control of the chaos that is reality. And then there's the second dimension of this hyper intelligent person, this hyper dedicated person who is just able to see through the cracks of society, able to decipher the illusions, etc., and so on and so forth. Now, the movie is really sold to us, right, as a movie where it's a detective movie, i.e. a movie that really plays to the intelligent side of Batman, to the dedicated side of Batman. And the movie, while watching it, truly does feel like a detective movie in a lot of sense. They really set up that vibe and that atmosphere and they pull you in with it. But once you start to reflect upon it, you realize that the movie is quite dumb and it actually undermines the Batman a lot. And here's the big spoiler, I guess. So the movie basically functions by the Riddler leaving the Batman a bunch of clues, i.e. riddles, in a bunch of murders. They're supposed to take Batman from point A to point B to point C. While taking Batman from point A to point B to point C, the Riddler is supposed to help Batman uncover the true extent to which Gotham is corrupt, but also help take down this corruption, help Riddler take down this corruption, and help Batman take down this corruption, and help reveal this to the larger part of society. But notice that this plot presupposes, right, that Batman doesn't know about this corruption. Now, it isn't a novel or a crazy story arc to have a story arc where the Batman isn't aware of the true extent of Gotham society. It's in one of the greatest Batman comic books of all time, or comic book series, The Court of Owls. That's the whole premise, right? There is this society within Gotham that has been behind many things that the Batman hasn't been aware of. And it's one of the greatest comic book storylines of all time, I would argue, because it's so intriguing that this person who demands control over all of Gotham, demands to know everything, must be able to prevent everything, hasn't been able to figure out that there is this underlying society pulling things from the shadows and have done so right under his nose all this time. However, the problem in this movie, and this is really problematic, right, is that the corruption that the Riddler reveals for Batman is this super basic corruption. It is the mayor is corrupt, the chief of police is corrupt, the district attorney or the district prosecutor is corrupt, and they're all involved with the mob. Now, they make it clear to us that Batman has been in Gotham for 2 years at the point at which the movie begins. So you're telling me that Batman in 2 years hasn't been able to figure out any of the most basic corruption in the movie? That just doesn't seem plausible at all. Because the archetypical Batman Inception storyline is the one where he goes back to Gotham and he starts directly engaging with the corruption of Gotham City and the mob, and those two of course overlap, right? So he's been there for 2 years and he hasn't really figured out anything at all about the extent to which the civil public servants and criminal enterprise overlap and are part of a joint enterprise to make Gotham this criminal hellscape. Now that doesn't really make sense, right? It just really undermines the Batman character. And so in light of that, you ask yourself, well, what has Batman been doing this entire time? And the only thing that we as the viewer, upon reflecting upon this, can infer is that he's sort of like gone around beating up like teenagers and taking down petty criminals. Because that is what it shows that he has done in the movie, right? In the first scene, they show him beating up like a teenage gang who goes around assaulting people. They show people that like spray paint on the walls being really afraid of him. They show people in these lone these lone robbers being really afraid of him. So that makes you believe that in these 2 years Batman has been there, he's only really affected those people. Now, of course, this severely takes away from the impressiveness of the Batman figure. But what is even more problematic is that it isn't as if this corruption was like deeply hidden. Because how the Riddler reveals the corruption to Batman is via like pictures of the mayor hooking up with a prostitute, pictures of the police commissioner, being engaged with this criminal mob guys, and really basic stuff like that. And it's all captured outside this like main criminal hub in Gotham City, which is this bar or like this club, which has an even more criminal club within it. So it's a club within a club where the real criminals go. And you're telling me that the Batman in 2 years, he never stood watching that club? He never stood observing it for a couple of days? He couldn't even figure out that there's a club within the club. Now, all of this just makes Batman seem really incompetent, right? It just makes him seem like a real dum-dum. And it's even more problematic given how shallow and immediate and surface level the evidence of the corruption that the Riddler provides with him are, telling us that the Batman wouldn't have to dedicate a lot of resources to uncover this corruption. But the final way in which this really undermines the Batman is that and undermines the movie overall, right? Is that the whole point of the Batman in this movie is that he's supposed to be this like detective person, this really unhinged person who just stays out all night watching from the dark, tracking down the criminal who's so obsessed, in the movie, right? He has these contact lenses and he rewatches the night all over again. So he just never ever stood watching the most criminal hub in Gotham. He never investigated the mayor. So it not only does it undermine the general Batman character and the way in which he's supposed to be impressive, it specifically undermines the dimension of impressiveness that the movie chose to highlight within the Batman character. And ultimately that just leaves you as the viewer with a sour taste in the mouth once you realize and start reflecting upon this. Because obviously you don't go to watch a Batman movie to not be impressed by the Batman character. So you kind of immediately upon reflection realize, well, the Batman in this movie, he kind of sucked. And given that he has no impressiveness in terms of physical stature or combat ability, you also have nothing else to hook upon your enjoyment of the Batman character, which is of course central to enjoying the Batman movie truly. And I want to underscore how bad this is and how bad it is done within the movie, right? It is so bad that the Riddler literally has to hold the hands of Batman and like gently guide him to uncover this corruption. Because at certain points, Batman can't even by himself figure out the riddles. Like certain riddles he gets help from Alfred. Now that's pretty bad, so he can't even do the riddles fully by himself. Other riddles he gets solved by virtue of his relationship to the Catwoman, so she kind of solves it for him. And other Riddlers, the Riddler literally has to hold his hand, and in the end, the Batman doesn't even solve all the riddles until the Riddler just tells him like, whoa, you're a lot dumber than I thought you were. So the Batman is very, very low intelligence in the movie, and there is really nothing redeemable, impressive about him. And he doesn't even take down the Riddler. He doesn't like catch the Riddler. The Riddler just surrenders to himself. So I think all of this that I just talked about hugely undermines the reflective enjoyment of the movie that you can have. Another dimension of the movie that really undermines the reflective enjoyment of the movie is that the movie is, whatever they want to say, is supposed to be a Batman Begins storyline, right? It's supposed to be a Batman coming of age storyline. That's really how they set it up to us. That's how the movie concludes, with Batman realizing he needs to be something more. He explicitly says so, right? And they do the basic Batman storyline of him and the mob, and him trying to like uncover the mob and take down the mob. Although in this version or iteration of the Batman movie, he does so just because the Riddler chooses to help him to do so. But the point here is that it is truly relevant to compare it to the Christopher Nolan version of the Batman Begins, right? And in the comparison, it just stands out quite bad. Although in the immediate experience that the viewer has of those movies, they would be quite similar. Once reflecting upon the movies, you come to realize that this version, i.e. the Batman, is a lot worse than the Batman Begins. Partially for the reasons I mentioned, but partially also because like so I'm doing a PhD in philosophy, right? Analytic philosophy. And I truly do believe that the Batman has a lot of depth to him, a lot of philosophical depth to be drawn upon from the thousands of comic books involving the Batman and the excellent writers who have portrayed him in those comic books. And this depth and this philosophical intrigue and psychological multidimensionality and nuance is often portrayed in the conversations that the Batman has with, or that certain characters have in the Batman movies. We see this a lot in like the Nolan versions of the Batman movies, right? They're very good conversations, they're very good quotes, they're very memorable, they make the viewer kind of like reflect upon their condition of existence in our world. But that is truly just lacking in the Batman movie. It is the conversation is just bad. It doesn't have any real depth to it once you start to think about it, and definitely not in comparison to the Nolan movies, which of course also takes away from the reflective enjoyment of the movie, because you don't come out feeling anything, this movie really made me kind of like question or consider or contemplate various issues regarding fear, criminality, control, the power structure and such like that, which I do think you get to some extent from the Nolan trilogies, each iteration or each instance of the Nolan trilogy, and this movie just doesn't have that. So in that comparison it just looks bad, and you're forced into this comparison by the movies being very similar, right? Another way in which the movie compares very bad to the Batman Begins movie is that, and this is kind of just like unfortunate, it's just that the casting isn't like as good, right? So Robert Pattinson just isn't as good of an actor as Christian Bale, generally speaking, and especially not for the Batman role, since Christian Bale has a very impressive physique to him. He's very believable as a person who's very athletic, mobile, hostile, while Robert Pattinson really isn't. Moreover, Michael Caine is way better than Andy Serkis, so I can pronounce that. Just again, unfortunate, because Michael Caine is a great actor, right? The Gary Oldman in this movie, he's good. No, sorry. So they have Gary Oldman as Jim Gordon in the original Nolan trilogy, and he's very excellent. Jim Gordon in this trilogy, he's good. He just isn't as good as Gary Oldman. Even the guy who plays the mob boss Falcone in this movie, he's okay. But the original Falcone from the Nolan trilogy is just, again, a very good actor. So the point being here is that once reflecting upon the Batman movie, you immediately start to realize that the movie has a plot that really undermines the Batman character in its totality. But moreover, given that the movie is naturally and immediately compared to the Batman Begins Nolan movie, you're immediately drawn into that comparison, and in that comparison the movie from this reflective state just looks a lot worse than the Batman Begins movie, and it really undermines this movie as like an enterprise. I want to say one more thing here, that I think this movie, that once upon reflecting upon this movie, the movie does really bad. And that is kind of like this. thing about how the Batman in this version of the movie, he's just portrayed as this like emo teenager to some extent, right? So in his interactions with Alfred, he's not grateful at all to Alfred. He's kind of like just mopes around a lot. But the most important thing here, I think, is that he 2 to 3 times in the movie, they really portray him as not being afraid to die. And I know that there is a storyline within the Batman universe of the Batman character where Batman reaches the point at which he's not afraid to die. But that storyline never makes sense for Batman in his early years, right? Because Batman in his early years is meant to be this extremely driven individual who's really dedicated to continuing the legacy of his family, to establish control over his city, and he's really afraid to die actually, because dying means that he would lose. And like, he's not afraid to die in the sense that he's afraid of the loss of consciousness and positive experience, but he's afraid to die because that means he would have lost the battle for control. He would have failed to continue the legacy of his parents, failed to redeem himself for as he holds himself blameworthy for his parents' death, because his parents' death happened because he couldn't control his fears, right? So, but in this movie, they portray the Batman really as being this like, I'm not afraid to die. They say so explicitly two times. And again, this just doesn't make sense for the Batman character. It takes away one of the kind of like the psychological archetype of the Batman character, but moreover, it really undermines Batman's relationship to Alfred in the movie in a really bad way that just makes the movie less enjoyable once reflecting upon it. So, although the movie is like a really good time in the cinemas, and I would, if someone asked me should I go and watch this movie, I'll be like, yeah, it's worth paying whatever, $20 or something to watch it in the cinema. Truly, I do think that the movie just doesn't hold up once starting to reflect upon it. And of course that brings me to the third and final ways in which you can enjoy a movie, the kind of like final dimension from which you can evaluate a movie, which is from the rewatch value. And I do think here, ultimately, the plot being so bad in the way in which it undermines the Batman character ultimately makes the movie for me not have that much rewatch value. So for example, so even though it's like a good movie in a lot of ways, it has a good score, good cinematography, it's very atmospheric, it has a good vibe, it does some things that are good, there are good character interactions and stuff. And it's like, in terms of a movie, it scores, for example, a lot, just in terms of like a movie, like what it means to have a good movie, it scores a lot better than, for example, Batman vs Superman. If I was in the mood to watch Batman on the big screen, or like on the TV or on my computer, whatever, and I couldn't watch the Christopher Nolan versions, or I just didn't feel in the mood for them, and I had to choose between kind of like watching Batman from Batman vs Superman or Batman from Batman Justice League, the Snyder Cut specifically, and watching Batman from this Michael Reeves instance of Batman in the Batman movie, I would choose the former, because there you at least get to enjoy the Batman character, which is what I think you want if you go and watch a Batman movie. Whereas this, although you enjoy the Batman character in the immediate experience of the movie, once you leave it and you immediately reflect upon the movie, I think that really takes away any ability to enjoy the movie while re-watching it. So also from the dimension of how good the movie is in terms of rewatch value, I would unfortunately score it very low. And ultimately, therefore, I think the Batman, although kind of like from the immediate experience of the movie, it scores pretty high, 7.7, 7.8 out of 10. Kind of almost at the same level as Batman Begins, slightly below, a bit step below Batman The Dark Knight Rises. Once reflecting upon the movie, once figuring out what rewatch value it has, I think it scores very low, around like a 6.4, 6.5. So just substantially below all of the Nolan Batman movies. And also, even though perhaps it competes with Batman versus Superman in terms of like overall movie quality, and it perhaps kind of arguably you can argue it competes with Batman or with the Batman movie arguably perhaps competes with Justice League the Snyder Cut. Although I would score that below, I think, but I could see the argument being made. I still think I would prefer to rewatch any of those movies because they have greater rewatch value, both in terms of being able to enjoy the character, but also even say what you want about like Snyder and his version of Batman vs Superman or his version of the Justice League. The Batman character in those movies actually have like good, meaningful quotes and dialogues and scenes that are cool and impressive, and that is just lacking from the Batman movie. And hence I would actually just recommend those also to anyone who is like interested in watching the Batman character. That's it for this movie review.